Afternoon. We're excited to be here. To introduce, this is my accomplished colleague, Clive Wilkinson, design director for Clive Wilkinson Architects, and I'm Tom Trenelone, design director with HDR, both based in the United States. Today we're going to take you through the project for the Shirley AbilityLab in Chicago, Illinois. The project is located in Streeterville in the city just north of the river. You can see Navy Pier off to the right there. And then this view is almost what you would be able to see from the John Hancock Tower. Fantastic part of the city. The building is 26 stories, mid-rise in Chicago, high-rise everywhere else. It is set up so it sets with a, and as Clive walks you through visually on the tour, it has an entry lobby where it goes up to a sky lobby, and then the Ability Labs are actually placed on the upper floors. The standard floor plate is about 4,600 square meters, and the building overall is about 120,000 square meters. It is the first of its kind as a brand new translational medical center. And the important thing to understand about that is that what we were brought in to do as a team was to completely reconsider not only operational, brand, interior environments, but the whole entirety of what they are going to do. And why you have to understand that this is a fantastic opportunity and a fantastic client is that they are the #1 rehabilitation institute in the world. There is no one that is really their peer, and yet they're looking to totally redefine exactly what they do. And so we went through there, and specifically today we are going to talk to you about the namesake of this, which is the cornerstone of their treatment, which is the Ability Lab. And the Ability Lab is based off of these principles of the ideas of thinking and speaking with both clinicians, researchers, caregivers, and their ability to exchange with each other. The other one is then general physical therapy, dealing with appendages, arms, hands, legs, walking, gait. The other one too is it's about exchanging of knowledge so that researchers, caregivers, and patients are all in the same place so they can talk about each other and see what's going on so that they can communicate better ways to allow them to solve the problems that they're facing, to grant them greater ability. And then ultimately, which is one of the greatest values that the folks at Shirley Ryan have, is their fantastic compassion and compassion for the human being as a whole. So what we did was we established the hierarchy of these. They went into areas of specialty, so they have a pediatric lab, which is a single story due to the fact that it has fewer patients, and then we have multi-stories like strength and endurance, arms and hands, and legs and walking, which have multiple, significant number of patients, and so we were able to do multi-story volumes. And then our final is the think and speak, which is a smaller unit. What it does, and what is most important, and you'll see this as Clive walks you through it, is that environmentally we changed completely. What happened is it used to be the patient went to all these places, and what the Ability Lab does is it actually brings all of them so that every single component, family, researchers, clinicians, therapists, and the patient all have a spot in a single space where they're allowed to see each other and inspire each other to create greater ability.
Thanks, Tom. One of the first things that struck us with the program, and we were incredibly excited to be invited to participate in this because in a way I think nothing could be more important than to have users who have such a kind of a traumatic condition and an intense need for help and treatment and architectural kind of engagement with the healing process. Hope and optimism were kind of put to us very early on by the client as being a major component of the success of treatment. If people believe that they can be cured and can rebuild their bodies, then that literally is halfway to the end of the process. So a whole kind of language of kind of optimism and engagement was evolved for the project. And as I was about to say, the first question that hit us was, if half of the people entering this building are entering on their backs, why is it that ceilings are not responding to that? So we developed a whole program about how the language of ceilings could actually be something that speaks to optimism and kind of the drive to kind of a physical improvement. So there's also a language of fluidity, of physical human components in the language of the graphics, that kind of makes this point, brings this point across. That's the actual entrance today, with the car entrance. There's also another ambulance one. In the reception area, the lobby on the 10th floor, we specifically wanted to break down the traditional reception experience. So in fact, the desk is these small pods, and patients and their families are greeted by the staff that is in the open space, and there's no barriers between the patient and the staff. The art project as well in the building was about addressing that same issue of patients on their backs. And the space design, of course, was very much oriented to frictionless movement, to celebrating movement in itself, because that is so much part of what the program of the building is about. And then that was taken into the floor surface as well. And in this case, they generally guide you in the building. In this case, it's actually guiding people to a small garden that's off the reception lobby in the distance there. Some images. When it came to the labs themselves, we were faced with this incredible, potentially stressful condition of scientists, researchers who are typically antisocial, hermetic people, being literally forced to work in the same space as the patients, the therapists, the physicians and doctors. And of course, these are kind of difficult environments, because a lot of these patients are missing limbs, well, sometimes many limbs. And there's a stressful condition. There was no furniture on the market that could actually deal with this thing, and the relationships were so particular that we ended up working with the client's various divisions, the doctors and as well as the therapists and the scientists, to develop a screening system to some extent, and also a componentized furniture system which was custom made for the hospital, in also fluid forms that would allow recomposition and rearrangement. So these lab spaces were still, in a way, functioning as kind of a factory sheds. The language of the ceilings would also come and engage with the walls. A very important diagram here explains the differences between the different labs. And I'll give you an example of the blue brain condition. Brain condition is the most traumatized condition. People who come in with major brain sort of trauma need an incredibly quiet environment. So you can follow the blue line and you see it's a slow-paced, it's individually focused, it's very fine-grained and very quiet. The absolute opposite of that, for instance, would be strength and endurance, where the speed is fast, it's a bright environment, it's communal, it's larger grain, and noise and energy is in fact a positive in that environment. Pediatric lab, in fact, engages all of the different conditions. There's a smaller kind of demand for pediatrics, but it was also very much focused around children and their experience. And families are a major issue with children in pediatrics. The family has to be there to support the children. So our reception area was extensively welcoming to families with their kids, and the families would be there throughout the pediatric experience with therapeutic experience with the kids. And they also had windows into the lab space. And this is the pediatric lab space. And we got into detail, like even designing the mat tables, adjustable mat tables. So instead of clinical rectangles, which they traditionally are, these are ergonomically designed so that more than one therapist can work on a patient at the same time, or even two patients can be worked on by one therapist. And here, typical lab strength and endurance. You can see the furniture system, which again is movable. And then staircases are a major component of the adult labs, about regaining kind of your ability to be mobile. Also, the floor surfaces were gradated so that you could measure your achievement. Arms and hands, very similar as well. And here in arms and hands, the graphic program specifically starts relating to arms and hands. And you can start seeing the kind of handprint above the lady who's actually going through therapy with her hands on, again, a customized mat table. screening for more personal treatment. Legs and walking. So the graphics are kind of a mix of inspiring language and also language that directs the path of your therapy treatment. We also grabbed the opportunity of ends of corridor conditions in the main kind of patient room areas, so that we could actually turn these into spaces which were much more welcoming and spontaneously useful to patients. Think and Speak was, again, that's the brain lab with brain trauma. So this was more unique. It was not a double height space. Again, the patients that are in here need extreme quiet and very controlled lighting. So all the colors and materials were about sound absorption and about very, very subtle gradations of color. And that's
Grand opening.
when we had a very happy client and very happy patients. So that's it.
Thank you very much. You mentioned at one point the scientists working in certain spaces, for them could be quite difficult in open plan. Academic workspace or scientific workspace can be tricky.
Yes.
And also patients' care, their trauma care was pivotal, and balancing those two components or those two types of people together was difficult. And I was just looking for, I thought you might answer that in terms of how you designed something to resolve some of those issues.
It's a good point. Of course, it was one of the most controversial aspects early on in the program, because the scientists and researchers who were part of the hospital were obviously kind of quite scared of that whole transition. But the CEO, who is herself a doctor, was very, very concerned about increasing the speed of a cycle of learning and innovation to get to treatments that would be effective and responsive to patients. So she literally wanted scientists and the researchers to feel and hear the pain.
But the other one that's interesting, like when you see this diagram, the spaces where the walls are actually taking place that are off to the right, they have portals in them, so that allows some of when they get to those moments where they're almost overcome with being out in public, the researchers, we did offer them respite to be able to step out. They're still able to see that, but they get a little more quiet, and that allows them. They also have a space there that you can see up in the corner that allows them to look out to the city views, Lake Michigan, and be off on their own. Because out of all of them, they were the most trauma. You would say it's not really truly trauma, because we're dealing with patients here with terrible stuff, but when we took them out of their regular research component, it was something definitely they had to learn to deal with.
Okay, thank you.
A very interesting, very thoughtful project. And I love the way you use designs on the ceiling, because it is obvious when you say it that you're on your back. But you started very clearly in the entrance and the main approaches, but it didn't seem to follow through the building. There were areas, for instance, in some of the labs which had ordinary ceilings. Did you ever think about being a bit more creative on the lab floors?
Some of the difficulties with so the latitude that was allowed us in some of the other spaces, when it came to putting the anti-gravity track and everything else that had to go into the ceiling system, it didn't allow us for as much surface area as we would have liked. The other is, so in those cases, the backs of the staircase and all of those became the areas where we could apply it. The other one too is that while it's incredibly unique, the flexibility of it was too, is the ability that we told them that their ability to completely take it apart and redo it had to be there as well.
I think the labs themselves are in a way sheds. They are spaces that are meant to evolve and change, and there's a lot of technology in the ceiling zone.
It was kind of like the example of MIT's Building 21 was always brought up, the idea that they could literally take stuff apart to try anything they wanted to in the space.
All right, thank you.
My question's really about the kit of parts, and I mean it's a bit like an office, and I don't mean that in a negative sense. I mean in the way that it used to be spoken about with offices, that you were creating scenery in basically a neutral space, which it seems to me what you're doing here is creating lots of different micro environments within a fairly straightforward enclosure.
Yeah.
But clearly this is much more complex functionally than an office, insofar as it's catering for all sorts of conditions, and some of those probably are quite extreme.
Yes.
So my question really is about how you develop the kit of parts, and whether the kit of parts was exhaustive to begin with, or whether you kept on adding new elements that the kind of trajectory which the kit of parts took from the beginning to the realization.
That's a good point. It's a good point. And the initial conversations were really about the ability of scientists, researchers, and also the doctors and everyone being able to have the equipment and the space kind of requirement that they personally needed. And some of that got extremely complex. I mean, there are tiny little things like that, which have a whole bunch of requirements to do with gloves and sterile equipment and things like this. So they really are. These pieces are largely equipment things. They're not decorative objects. This is a bunch of equipment, and just resolving the interrelationships and the number of different kind of cooks in the kitchen, so to speak, in producing these was quite a challenge.
And did any of these things become products that might be relevant to other health environments?
It's a good question. This sort of thing is not done typically in any other health environments, and that in a way was why it was so kind of unusual.
And most of it is done in a thing where the patents that actually have been done with the team and Shirley Ryan, they hold those. So like those tables, the custom tables that were designed, that are telescopic, they can raise and they can lower, they're all right now completely their property. And again, this is one of those that competitive edge that they have, is that they want the world to be able to come in and see it, but right now, maybe in the future they'll be available.
It may be a big prototype.
Maybe in the future. I think they've only been in the building now for just about a year now, right? We're about a year, so I think the further down the road it goes, they might actually be out there.
I mean, for us, solving the bigger problem of this thing being almost a noisy marketplace of all these different specialties and conditions and these patient, things happening in the same space, this was like mind-blowing to us. It was mind-blowing to a lot of the people who were involved in it as well. So maybe we could have actually taken to another realm of ambition, but our ambition here was to actually, in a way,
No, but it was to fulfill this environment.
fulfill the
I
environment
understand.
and make the marketplace of this space work.
I have this obvious question about the colors. So
Yeah.
how did you choose these colors? Because I find this reddish, yellowish, purple color very stimulating, and if I'm sitting in the totally red room, so it will raise my blood pressure. So how come?
Very much conversations with the doctors and the CEO. The CEO actually wanted orange, red and orange as the brand colors, specifically for raising blood pressure.
It is one where, different than a regular acute care facility, this is one of those things where it's about work. By the time they get back to their room after the end of the day, they are tired because they have been working them out, almost like being a pro athlete going to training every single day. And the energy and stuff that's provided by the graphics was a major part of that. Plus, it then translates to this fantastic new brand that they have that really separates them in the marketplace.
It is unusual. They actually pressure the patient. They drive the patient to improve themselves.
My question was actually quite similar. I was wondering also because graphic design seems to be an important element here, not just for the branding, but to really enhance the healing and working environment, so both components. And maybe just to continue on the subject of the use of color psychology is so important. It really translates not just into our emotional states, but also to our muscular reactions sometimes. So I noticed that you had different color combinations per units.
Yes.
And perhaps beyond the obvious question, what they represent, because ones are cooling and sort of calming, nurturing sort of purple hues, and the other ones are stimulating. I wonder how you managed to sort of negotiate these two seemingly contrasting demands from the patients requiring a very particular kind of color-based scheme, and on the other hand, the researchers, the doctors working there that, as you described earlier, have a different trajectory in work.
I probably should also say, like so many other projects, what you see in these images are like highlights of the project. There's of course an enormous amount of bland space that's part of a hospital. So I think it's not overwhelming. In fact, there are a lot of very, very quiet areas. Typically the corridors that surround these labs are pretty neutral.
It's a nice gradual transition from a patient experience, which is relatively neutral, to the idea that once you reach the AbilityLab, the power of the graphic and the color is intended to the point where you know that what you're going to be doing is working while you're there. And then again, it's a gradual transition back to the room at the end of the day where we're trying to cool them out and allow them to go back and kind of rest because they've got another big day coming up right after. Typical stay is they're in for 30 days typically, so it's a long stay.
I admire the fact that you took on this project because I know for a fact it's very challenging.
Yeah.
And obviously emotionally must be very emotional to be engaged in these kind of projects. And I love the fact that you have these pods. I called it spatial prosthesis because it's actually you go in and be revived and restore and rehabilitate and you
That's
become
a great word.
become a
Spatial
different
prosthesis.
individual. So I can even see these pods going on to different cities, different parts, with different sectors. The question I have, I guess, for you guys is the fact that the circulation are all painted. I notice your stairway is painted orange and you have circulation, and maybe you guys didn't have the budget, but imagine if you look at that axon of these objects you had, if the circulation was like a landscape, Clive, the idea of a landscape.
It's not all painted, by the way, Lyndon. That's terrazzo in the main space, and Port Terrazzo.
More budget than I thought. Okay.
And typically in the labs, it's actually rubber floor that's all been cut
Okay.
in these shapes.
Because I do see the stairway. I see some of the stairways being painted or terrazzo, whatever that is. And maybe it's programmatically. Imagine all these modular. I was wondering if the space would have been created a landscape of some sort to create a different alternative in terms of viewing, in terms of how things are perceived, how movements are done. So was that just purely a requirement, a physical requirement that leads you guys to just make it all flat?
Yeah, I mean, it's one where, so you can, everywhere that you see the color, that's again where we talked about why we couldn't do much in the ceilings there. What they have is a track that's almost like a carnival ride where they can determine how much gravity you're going to take, which helps improve, that's the way that they can speed up healing. But what happens with that is that then those graphics became like, they put the gradients in there so that we could sit there and say, you need to go here or here. When they wanted to do a space where they wanted to have like texture or change, Clive designed, like you can see the staircases that actually can be moved into those spaces, and they can use those to go up there, and so they can move back and forth, but they didn't allow us to really do anything that would be of permanence.
I see.
Thank you so much.